Obedience, aligning our will with God's will. Welcome back to our series on Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. In our previous episode, we discussed the virtue of patience and how it helps us trust in God's timing. Today, we will focus on the virtue of obedience, which St. Francis de Sales describes as the path to aligning our will with God's. Let's explore what obedience means, why it's essential to the devout life, and how we can grow in this virtue. Understanding obedience. Obedience, as St. Francis de Sales teaches, is the humble submission of our will to God's will. It's about trusting that God's plan for our lives is better than our own desires and choosing to follow His commands even when it's difficult or unclear. Obedience is not about blind submission, but about recognizing that God knows what's best for us. Obedience requires humility and trust. It means being willing to listen to God's voice in prayer, through Scripture, and in the guidance of those He has placed in our lives, whether it's our spiritual leaders, community, or circumstances. St. Francis de Sales emphasizes that obedience is a powerful way to grow in holiness because it requires us to surrender control and align our hearts with God's will. For example, consider a religious sister who is asked to take on a role that she feels unqualified for. Rather than resisting, she chooses to obey her superior's request, trusting that God's plan will unfold through her obedience. Over time, she discovers new strengths and gifts she didn't realize she had, and her trust in God deepens. The importance of obedience in our vocation. For those of us in religious life, obedience is essential for living out our vocations. St. Francis de Sales teaches that obedience is at the heart of religious life, where we commit to following God's will as expressed through our superiors, the Church, and God's commands. In religious life, obedience is an expression of trust in God's providence. It helps us grow in humility and discipline, reminding us that our lives are not our own, but are dedicated to serving God's purposes. When we embrace obedience, we allow God to work through us, even when His plans are different from our own. For example, imagine a seminarian who is asked to serve in a challenging mission that he hadn't anticipated. At first, he is unsure, but he chooses to trust in the obedience he has promised to his vocation. Through this experience, he not only grows in faith, but also discovers a deeper calling to serve others in unexpected ways. The obstacles to obedience. While obedience is a powerful virtue, there are obstacles that can make it difficult to practice. St. Francis de Sales identifies several common challenges. Obstacle number 1: pride and self-will. Pride and self-will can hinder our ability to obey. When we are attached to our own plans and desires, it becomes harder to submit to God's will or the direction of those in authority. St. Francis de Sales encourages us to cultivate humility, recognizing that God's wisdom is greater than our own. Obstacle number 2: fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown can prevent us from practicing obedience. Sometimes obedience requires stepping into situations that are uncomfortable or unfamiliar. St. Francis de Sales reminds us that God's will often leads us into unknown territory, but it is precisely there that we grow in faith and trust. Obstacle number 3. Resistance to authority. Resistance to authority can challenge our ability to be obedient, especially when we struggle to trust those in leadership. St. Francis de Sales teaches us to view our superiors and leaders as instruments of God's will, trusting that He works through them to guide us on our spiritual journey. How to cultivate obedience? So, how can we actively cultivate obedience in our lives? St. Francis offers several practical steps to help us grow in this virtue. Step number 1. Practice listening in prayer. Obedience begins with a heart that is open to hearing God's voice. Spend time in quiet prayer, asking God to show you His will for your life. The more we listen to God, the more we will be able to follow Him faithfully. Step number 2. Trust God's providence. When faced with difficult choices or directions, remember that God is in control and that He has a plan for your good. Trusting in His providence allows us to obey with peace, knowing that His will is always for our ultimate happiness. Step number 3. Practice small acts of obedience. Practice obedience in small ways every day, whether it's following the guidance of your spiritual director, obeying the rules of your community, or simply accepting the circumstances you are in. Each act of obedience builds trust in God's will and strengthens your ability to follow Him in greater things. St. Francis teaches that obedience leads to greater freedom, peace, and alignment with God's will. When we practice obedience, we are freed from the burden of always trying to control everything and instead can rest in the knowledge that God is leading us. Obedience deepens our relationship with God and helps us grow in trust and humility. It allows us to align our desires with God's, leading to a more peaceful and fulfilling life. Through obedience, we experience the joy of living in harmony with God's plan. In conclusion, obedience is an essential virtue for living the devout life. St. Francis de Sales invites us to embrace obedience as a way to align our will with God's and to trust in His providence. By listening in prayer, trusting in God's plan, and practicing obedience in small ways every day, we can grow in holiness and experience the freedom that comes from surrendering to God's will. As we conclude today's session, let's reflect on a few key takeaways about obedience. Number 1, obedience is aligning our will with God's. It involves trusting that God's plan is better than our own and choosing to follow His commands. Number 2, obedience is essential in our vocation. It helps us grow in humility and trust, allowing God to work through us in ministry and service. Number 3, recognize obstacles to obedience. Pride, fear of the unknown, and resistance to authority can hinder our ability to obey. Seek to overcome these barriers. Number 4, practical steps to cultivate obedience. Listen in prayer, trust in God's providence, and practice small acts of obedience daily. Number 5. The fruit of obedience is peace and freedom. Living a life of obedience leads to greater freedom, alignment with God's will, and deep inner peace. Thank you for joining me today as we explored the virtue of obedience. In our next episode, we will discuss the importance of temperance and how it helps us live balanced and disciplined lives. Until then, live Jesus.